Now, in the United States, by the late 1700s, the slave trade was firmly established, and all aspects of the slave trade were firmly accepted in wider society. And this included rape, torture, neglect, having the power to determine who could have children with whom, separating those that would be considered family for the slave owner's benefit. Whatever the slave owner wanted happened. In theory, marriages were allowed, although they were not legally recognized, hence the tradition of jumping the broom. During slavery, brooms were available to the enslaved and could be used in wedding ceremonies. So enslaved people would jump over the broom to marry since they could not legally wed. Even if they did this, however, whatever the slave owner wanted occurred, so it was not uncommon for families to be split up. Now, the Civil War began in the U.S. in 1861 and ended in 1865, at which time slavery was abolished. This was not the main goal of the Civil War, as is popularly understood at the outset, but it did become a goal of the war. There were some free African Americans before the war even began, although they were very restricted in their lives compared to white Americans and had little to no legal recourse for discrimination or violence against them. Thus, most were poor and illiterate, two factors that, of course, would directly affect their family life. Now, in the previous class, or the one before, I in the text mentioned resilience as an important factor affecting families. And if ever there was an example of that in action, it's African American families in pre-industrial society, both enslaved and free in the U.S. Whether legally married or not, whether told who to bear children with, whether one's partner or children were removed from their daily lives, the family bonds formed often persisted. Now, your text has a section focusing specifically on Mexican American families, because their Mexican population is significantly larger than in Canada. And I'm not going to focus on this, but I do want to highlight a few things. Mexicans may not have been a large part of the slave trade in the U.S., but there is no denying the importance of Mexican labor, especially in some parts of the southern U.S. in building the country, both men and women, and how they also were resilient as a whole despite being underpaid and often living in poor conditions. Now, historically, one's family in Mexican culture is viewed with the utmost importance no matter what, with extended family often considered to be just as important and essential, and with multi-generational households being the norm as a result of that. Even godparents chosen by the parents were considered a daily part of life and were expected to participate in raising children. Something Mexican culture and Mexican families are also known for is a strong reliance on patriarchal authority, referred to as machismo. While for women, their primary focus was and is traditionally to be the home and children, a very traditional approach. Now, this also means that growing up, boys and girls were socialized to encompass this, although in modern times it's not quite as strong. So if we kind of step back for a moment and really try to look at the big picture, as we progress through history and how that has affected the evolution of family, there is an absolute clear dividing line between pre-industrial and industrial society. There are absolute and complete differences between the two. And, to me, it's almost like comparing apples and oranges because daily life was so different. And just to be clear, I'm going to discuss these two processes as one event because urbanization is so dependent on industrialization. When this occurred in both the US and Canada, when industrialization occurred, which caused urbanization, it altered virtually every aspect of family life you can think of, because the family lost its role in society as an economic unit of production, and instead people worked for somebody else for a paycheck. Industrialization spawned great changes in basic family structure, in work, in styles of work, patterns of work, effects of work, and lifestyle overall. In regards to family, it affected life on a daily basis and affected society on a structural basis. As I said, as a result of industrialization, families were no longer required for economic reasons to remain so tightly knit. They were no longer solely reliant on each other. Many people, especially the young, sorry, somebody's walking by. Lola, be quiet. Many families, especially the young, left the farms and their tight-knit communities that were strongly based on mutual reliance to work in factories. And what this did was lead to the dissolution of close-knit extended families in many ways. Instead of being tied to the home because you were needed to assist with the farm or family tasks, young people were now more free in a sense to choose something else. They had the option of taking a different path instead of just automatically following the expected to continue the family farm. What effect did this have on communities as a whole and on individual families? This meant that entire communities were eventually dissolved, or at least greatly weakened, as people began to move to less rural areas. Entire communities based on and structured around individual economic family units, and in turn, larger extended family networks, began to move away in a way they had never done before in history. In a more philosophical sense, a more theoretical sense, it could easily be argued that with the shift away from highly localized family production came a related shift of family values. This is what the conservative perspective of family would argue, or they would at least argue this was the beginning. Socially speaking, the traditional bonds of interfamily support that arose out of economic necessity, particularly because of farm-related and family tasks, was no longer quite as essential. So the Industrial Revolution, and thus urbanization, really altered, changed, weakened traditional nuclear and extended family bonds. But at the same time, depending on your perspective, it provided opportunity and the potential to move away from these traditional family networks. So it created a possible different path for young people, although whether that path was negative or positive is a matter of opinion. So whatever your opinion, the result was a shift from a cohesive, self-contained family unit relying on one another for economic and social support to something that was much more fragmented. Now, if you really take a step back and kind of look ahead, while continuing to focus on this point in time, there's something else that evolved from the shift caused by urbanization and industrialization. And that is, this was the beginning of something that we're all very familiar with, the male breadwinner stereotype. Moving from self-employment or family employment to a paid labor force working for a paycheck was the beginning of the construction of career trajectories based on the male breadwinner model. The entire idea of the male head of household being the primary economic pillar, of the male head of household being responsible for being the main provider that everybody would depend on, that in the 1900s became central. This breadwinner idea emerged as a result of industrialization and the development of wage labor. And this norm continued to be just that for decades to come. This, in turn, the emergence of the male breadwinner norm, keeping the domino effect in mind, was one of the things that led to gender roles beginning to take on a more distinct appearance in Western society. As paid labor for men became the norm, it led to gender roles becoming increasingly defined. It didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen in a few months. They didn't develop suddenly. And you all know that there had always been a distinction in gender roles, a distinction regarding men and women's work. But this caused gender roles to become more defined, more rigid, regarding work and a male or female's role in the family. their perceived role, what their role should be. Now, that doesn't mean that women or children did not also work outside the home. Don't get confused here, because I know it's going to sound like I'm saying one thing and immediately saying the other. Yes, some women worked outside the home, that's correct. But it was after industrialization that the ideal emerged that women should not, because their main focus should be the children at home. It was after industrialization that what is known as the cult of domesticity emerged, or this ideology that work and home should be two completely separate spheres of life. Sorry, just lost my spot. It was after industrialization that this perception of women as needing to be cared for, as being much more delicate than men, as women needing to be protected from the big bad world by men, really evolved. Which I always find really odd and just completely nonsensical. And not just from my perspective now. You know, when North America was first colonized, the women who were there were expected to be really tough because they had to be. Yet after several decades, over 100 years of proving how tough they were and how much they could handle, after industrialization, they were increasingly viewed as delicate and in need of authority, which never made sense to me. And in addition, even after industrialization, you had living examples of what women could handle, since poor and immigrant women still worked just as hard, including in factories. So as industrialization continued, fewer women worked outside the home, if at all possible. In the beginning of industrialization, children also continued to actively contribute to their family's economic stability. They continued to work. In fact, for many lower-class working families in the late 19th century, they remained partially dependent on their children's earnings. So think about that for a second. That a family would be actually dependent on the money their children would contribute to the household. Child labor continued to be a very common practice. And although conditions might have improved with growing awareness and eventually new laws, at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in Canada and the US, children were simply expected to work and contribute. In these early towns, kids played a role in building up the household wage, what the house earned as a whole. So for example, a miner who, let's say, had 2 or 3 sons over the age of 8 could double his income by taking them into the mines with him. A woman who worked in a factory would earn 1/3 or sometimes half the pay of a man, and children earned less than that, even though work days for children were usually 14 to 16 hours, just like adults. And if you look at what this did to the children, working long hours in dirty, unsanitary places with such dangerous working conditions, and suffering from a lack of sunlight and nutrition. So I'm going to read you something from the Factory Inquiry Commission in 1833. This is a direct quote. The hours of labor at that mill were from 5 in the morning till 8 at night, with an interval for refreshments of 30 minutes at noon. I have been in the mills at all hours, and I have never seen in my life the machinery stopped at meal times in any of the mills. End quote. So it was in the 1890s, that factory laws were really put in place that stated boys under the age of 12 and girls under the age of 14 could not participate in paid labor. So before that, they could. And even after that, if a boy was 12, he could still work full-time in a factory. But I mean, just think about that. So boys under the age of 12 and girls under the age of 14 could not participate in paid labor. The fact that boys could work at 12 and girls could not further helped to reinforce the male breadwinner ideal, that the work of a male was more necessary. And as industrialization progressed, just as it became less and less common for women to work, the same occurred for children. Supported by the emergence of child labor laws, by the slow but steady development of a formal education system, and the early beginning of the recognition of childhood as a distinct stage of life with its own special considerations. Now, if you take a look at what constituted labor at the time, working conditions for everybody were horrible, miserable, dirty, unsanitary, and often dangerous. Oh, what am I doing? Going the wrong way. There we go. It was standard to work 14 to 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, earning maybe 10 cents an hour, 8 to 10 bucks a week, and skilled workers didn't make much more. Factories were not ventilated at all. And remember, this was the age of coal. So that daily workers would finish their shifts covered in black soot, having worked in smoke all that time. Of course, their health would be severely affected by this, and often workers would develop what they called the black lung, which simply meant that their respiratory system could no longer process all of that smoke. Factories were dimly lit, relying on sunlight coming through the windows, and safety precautions were minimal. It was not uncommon for workers to be injured and sometimes even lose a limb. And then after work, especially in the early part of the Industrial Revolution, people would go home to where they lived in urban areas that were quickly constructed with no plumbing, no sanitation. People crowded in small areas and small apartments and small houses. These really crowded living conditions in factory cities were not only overcrowded, but dirty, unheated, and unventilated. And these serious problems of sanitation meant that it often simply didn't exist, so open sewers ran alongside the streets. The water supply was often tainted, causing illness and disease. Impure milk would cause infants to be sick, or even any adults who drank it. Food supplies were unreliable, so that simple hunger was common. And because what was available to eat was so narrowly based, even when food was available, nutrition problems were common. In short, many workers found themselves living in urban slums and having little to no money to pay for medical care when it was really needed. Diseases were highly contagious because of the lack of sanitation, and even more rampant as people were now living so closely together. And these diseases seemed to be untreatable, sometimes even unrecognized, because at this point there was no germ theory of disease. So people just didn't take precautions to prevent the spread of infections because they didn't understand what was going on. Now, immigration is not something most people would think of in regards to how families have developed and evolved over the years because, well, it's immigration. How the heck is that going to have an effect? But if you've ever studied how Canada and the United States evolved, you'll know that immigration is a really significant issue because so many people came to Canada and the US in such a short period of time that it really altered the population as a whole. Not just in terms of numbers, but also in terms of bringing their culture with them. We're not talking about hundreds or thousands. We're talking about millions of people in a relatively short period of time. They came to this continent looking for a better life, hoping to be able to get more out of the life they had than in their home countries. And in doing so, they provided the labor needed to support industrialization. Now, I already described how life working in these newly mechanized industries was pretty dismal and the problems that existed in residential areas. But immigrants and their families had it even tougher because they were truly the poorest of the poor. As indicated in the text, while pretty much no industrial workers lived in good conditions, immigrants had it the worst. So thinking about this on one hand is interesting, but our focus is on families and family life. How did these living conditions affect families beyond the obvious, health concerns, and general uncomfortableness? Well, if it was your family living in these conditions, what would the effect be? A lot of worry, concern, stress, heightened anxiety, a lot of strain, which would in turn cause a lot of social problems to become pretty common. drinking, gambling, violence at various levels, petty crime, and the immigrants also had to contend with discrimination. For example, Irish immigrants at one point faced severe discrimination. And as a result of this, is when the first urban ethnic enclaves started to develop, which we're familiar with now. The Irish living in one area, Italians in another, creating Little Italy, Chinese in another, etc. Now at this point, I think it's good to let's just summarize what we've discussed so far. I began by asking whether the good old days were really as good as some people like to say they were. We looked at pre-industrial societies where just a subsistence economy was the norm, evolving into agricultural and horticultural societies and how that affected families by creating a surplus, which meant that you could have a larger group of people in one place. And this was the beginning of inequality because some people had more and some had less. Then we proceeded to families in early Europe, how by that point social stratification had been firmly developed, and that the importance of patrilineal descent had been established. A brief look at indigenous families before colonization occurred. Remember, there is variation, and that women in some tribes had an elevated position. Then we proceeded with colonial families, who were economic units of production and reproduction, with children working just as hard. We moved on to slavery. It did occur in Canada and in the US. One of the main arguments to end slavery was the negative effect on family units. A few brief comments about Mexican families before going into detail regarding the effect of industrialization and urbanization on virtually every single aspect of family life. As we continue, we're going to really jump ahead in history. There's some really significant things that occurred that directly affected family life and family structure overall in the 20th and 21st centuries. 2 world wars, Great Depression, advances in technology and industrialization, a more steady and formal education system that became more easily available to everybody, widespread, easily available and effective birth control, the development of the suburbs, vaccines that eliminated several childhood diseases, the automobile, advances in gender equity. There are several events or changes that occurred during this time period. So to summarize it all, I would say that generally speaking, independence and individualism really surged, both in Canada and the US. And as a result of that, the structure of families changed, the way families were formed changed, and their daily lives changed. Really basic, fundamental structural changes in families as a whole occurred. And since families are one of the most important social structures in society, they affected society as a whole. Now, I might be older than most of you, but no, despite my son always teasing me about being old, I was not alive during the Great Depression. Although my mom was as a child and my granny was a married woman with a family. Maybe you've talked to family members who were alive at that time. When you were growing up, they make comments about how difficult things were. And you kind of giggle at them and don't really listen much because frankly, it's just not relevant for you. But as you become an adult yourself, and maybe have kids, if you're like me, you begin to think about the effect of the Great Depression on society. And you begin to think about how difficult it must have been to raise a family during that time. Everybody's heard of the Depression. It was a worldwide economic recession. And we all know it had a really high unemployment rate. And we know that Canada entered World War II, which then propped up our economy and the Depression ended. But what was life like on a daily basis for families during the Great Depression?